Good evening and welcome to the Rockwell Museum. My name is Tom Daly. I'm the education intern. I'm sorry, I'm not the intern anymore. I'm the curator of education. And it's my pleasure tonight to welcome all of you here to hear a lecture from a very incredible educator, a person that understands illustration not only theoretically, but actually, as you look through this exhibition with Dennis Nolan tonight, you're not only going to see works from across the decades and centuries, but you'll see some of his work as well. You might be a little shy about pointing it out, so ask him if you don't see it as we go through a gallery. He's really been one of the strong forces in illustration art today. Without guessing your age, he's influenced generations of illustrators, folks that you know that come into your house every day or come into your everyday life through magazines and other aspects of the world that have illustration. So Dennis Nolan tonight is going to give you a fantastic tour of this collection. We're going to see from his point of view how illustration spans over 400 years. So I hope that you enjoy the program tonight. Do feel free to come back. We have Thursday evening programs every Thursday during the summer. We also have a number of weekend programs. You can check our website. There's this thing called Facebook. I guess you can look there too. And we are streaming this live tonight, so you guys might be on TV. Pretty exciting. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dennis Nolan. And please feel free, illustrators, like you applaud.
Thank you. Hi. We're going to start in this room, and we'll be moving along, and we'll move around the room. So bear with me. You'll have to get up and see this painting and see that painting, because I think that the best way to talk about this is to really talk about each painting. The idea behind this show, as Tom said, I'm an illustrator, and I've always been interested in I'm a teacher as well, and I've always been interested in how an idea gets down onto a piece of paper or onto a canvas, like most of these are. The initial idea behind a painting, in this case, are stories. That's why we call it the narrative tradition. Every one of these canvases in here tells a story of some sort. It could be a small story or a very elaborate story. It can be from literature like this, or a biblical source. As you look around, you'll see many sources for the stories, but they're all stories told with a paintbrush. And in this room, this is the Norman Rockwell room for this show, and we have an NC Wyeth room and a Maxfield Parrish room. I chose three illustrators from the golden age of illustration to tell the story. And the reason that we chose those three is that Maxfield Parrish, who's in the far room, was probably the most well-known illustrator of an invented land. The Maxfield Parrish imagined story, sort of fairy tale land. And the stories that he told were either based on fairy tales or they were inventions of his own. Then we chose N.C. Wyeth because he was the great illustrator of the classics. Most of N.C. Wyeth's well-known paintings are for classic literature, a lot of American literature. And Norman Rockwell is well known as probably America's favorite storyteller with a paintbrush. Stories that he invented, stories that he pulled from literature, like Ichabod Crane here. And so they're storytellers, but they're not only storytellers, they're great drawers. They could really draw the face and body expressions that they needed to tell their story. And they could draw all the details that told us so much about the narrative. But the main idea behind this show was, well, if they could all draw, who taught them? Who taught them to draw? No one is born knowing how to draw. Children draw, of course, but to really become an expert at the kind of drawing that they needed to tell their stories, they needed to be taught. So the question was, who taught Norman Rockwell? And we have an answer for that. and who taught his teacher, and who taught his teacher. So as we continue to ask that question, we came up with some pretty fascinating folks and some great paintings. So let me start with Norman Rockwell, and the way that I planned this show. This is one of my drawings that I'm going to be shy about. In each one of the rooms, there's a tree. The idea is sort of based on Norman Rockwell's family tree. And at the top in this particular room is Norman Rockwell and his two main teachers, his two favorite teachers at the Art Students League, Thomas Fogarty and George Bridgman. George Bridgman's teacher, Jean-Leon Jerome. Jerome's teacher, Glare. Glare's teacher, Hersant. We go down here to Reynaud, Lepeci, Van Loo. We're down here at 1705. Okay, so you can trace Rockwell from his teacher to his teacher's teacher, his teacher's teacher, his teacher's teacher. These aren't just influences. These are his actual teachers, the people who taught him perspective, who taught him anatomy, who taught him how to draw. There's also in every room next to the tree, there's a plate that tells the basic education of each one of these three artists. Now, Norman Rockwell started studying when he was a teenager, and he first attended the Chase School for just a very short time, but then he entered a class at the National Academy of Design, and he studied with. Let's move around here. What I did was when Jesse and I designed where the paintings would be, started with a very early Rockwell. So this painting by Rockwell, Checkers, was painted for a magazine story. And Rockwell is using most of the classical picture-making devices that all the rest of these painters have used over the last 500 years. Setting a figure with his back turned, inviting you into the picture. Right? Creating a space here, a floor that these characters can sit on. Bringing us into this story. Now we don't even, the story that he's telling was a story in the magazine, but we don't really even need the words here, right? You know, there's a fascination with the body expression, the way that hand is sitting like this, his facial expression. Now the construction of this painting is based on, like I said, picture-making devices that were popular throughout history. And his first teacher at the National Academy of Design was George Willoughby Maynard, who taught him life drawing. So Rockwell was first learning how to draw the figure when he was about 16 years old in George Maynard's classroom. George Maynard taught at the National Academy of Design in New York City. And George Maynard was mostly a muralist. At the late 1800s, a great many state capitals and government buildings were being constructed, a great many mansions being built in Newport, New York, Boston, and George Maynard was employed as a muralist for a number of buildings. George Maynard not only studied taught at the National Academy of Design, he had been a student there as well. His teacher was Edwin White. Edwin White here, who's painting the picture of the called Thoughts of Liberia. Edwin White taught at the National Academy of Design as well. And Edwin White's teacher was Francois Picot in France. In the mid-1800s, Americans who wanted to paint story pictures like this, who wanted to paint figures that felt real, wanted to construct a space with accurate perspective and light and shadow that would hold the picture together. If the American painters wanted an education, most of them went to France. France was the art capital of the world, and they had some great schools with some great teachers. And so they would go to France, gather their education, and come back and start teaching in the United States. So it was the French academic method of teaching that Edwin White brought back to the National Academy, taught George Willoughby Maynard at the National Academy, who taught Norman Rockwell. Okay, so a great lineage of French and American teaching. So let's go to this corner over here. So the checkers painting that Rockwell painted was painted for the magazine story. This painting of Tom Sawyer whitewashing the fence was painted for Mark Twain's book. Great piece. Again, all the picture-making devices that he's using here. The dark against light, the light against dark, the back of the figure inviting you into the picture. Great composition. So Rockwell's second teacher at the National Academy, actually they team taught. So he was in a class that George Willoughby Maynard taught, as well as Francis Coate Jones, this guy here. Francis Coate Jones was a team teacher with Maynard for many years at the National Academy of Design. And just like Maynard, Jones was also a muralist. Much of his work is in the was in murals, a lot in the of government buildings. Again, he's using the same sort of picture-making devices. He's using his perspective here, the accurately drawn figure, as a result of drawing from the model over and over and over. Two different methods of drawing that both of these teachers taught. Cast drawing, that is drawing from plaster casts of antique statuary from Greek and Roman statues, and life drawing from the live model. So Francis Coate Jones actually went to France for his education, and he studied with this guy, Henry Lehmann. And Henry Lehmann taught drawing at the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the official school of France, the state school of France. And it was free, run by the government. But everyone who entered the École des Beaux-Arts had to take drawing before they could take painting. And so Henry Lehmann was the drawing teacher. They all had to pass through Henry Lehmann's class. It was a real taskmaster. Henry Lehmann studied with Ang, the painter, Ang. This was a commission for probably a family chapel. And you can see the different subject matter as a result of different clients. The clientele for the Tom Sawyer piece was the publisher. The clientele for this was probably a wealthy industrialist who wanted a decorative picture for his wall. The client for this was someone who had a family chapel in somewhere in France. So after Rockwell spent a year at the National Academy of Design, he switched schools, and he started to study at the Art Students League. The Art Students League in New York, a little more liberal school. They actually had an illustration class there. There was no illustration class at the National Academy of Design. And by illustration class, it just means a class where the students were asked to tell stories with their pictures. They weren't just learning to draw the figure or the landscape or the still life. They were actually composing storytelling pictures. And this is Rockwell's great piece here for the story of Louise May Alcott.
Where was the School of Design?
The Art Students League.
The School of Design.
Which School of Design?
Well, the one you mentioned.
Oh, the National School of Design.
Yes.
I'm not sure which building they were in at the time, and right now they're in between buildings. They've moved a couple of times.
They were in New York?
They were in New York.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. They were right off Central Park somewhere in New York. And yeah, both schools were in New York. The Art Students League was actually a break-off school from the National Academy of Design. The National Academy of Design was one of the oldest schools around. It was started by Samuel Morse, the Morse code Morse, and it had been around for years. And then it was having financial trouble and it had to close. And the students said, "We need a school," so they started the Art Students League. Yeah. So then there were two schools, and they both continued. They're both still around. And Thomas Fogarty was Norman Rockwell's illustration teacher. He taught the illustration class. And Fogarty had all of his students find a story in a magazine. The magazines were full of stories. There was no television, but people's need for entertainment was just as great. And the magazines had lots and lots of stories. So Fogarty would have the students find a story, then they'd have to come up with a sketch, find models, find costumes, find props, all the things that a professional illustration job would call for, finish the drawing, and finish the painting. So Rockwell got a real education in how to finish a story illustration. Fogarty was also the man who gave Norman Rockwell his first jobs. He found jobs at magazines to illustrate stories when Rockwell was just about 17 years old. So this is a painting by Fogarty, and Fogarty was a working illustrator as well as a teacher. And Thomas Fogarty's teacher was Henry Siddons Mowbray. Henry Siddons Mowbray, another muralist like Jones and Maynard, something to do with the era, the time. Artists worked for clients, and the clients at that time were wanted murals. So Henry Siddons Mowbray was also educated in France. He went to France and studied with Léon Bonnat. So again, Rockwell's teacher Fogarty, taught by Mowbray, taught by a French teacher. So there's that French connection once again. These three great pieces by Rockwell in his mature stage show three aspects of Rockwell's picture making. For his advertising work, which he considered different than illustrating. He said, when I'm illustrating, I'm putting someone's words into paint, like Mark Twain. This was advertising, and these two pieces are his own inventions. So he said, here I'm a storyteller. But even in this advertisement, you can see the care that he lavished on all of his details. Just as much care here as any of his other paintings. So he wasn't just slapping out an advertising illustration just because he had a deadline. Very careful, beautiful work. Real sensitive simplicity and sensitive complications, right? You know, the difference between these two compositions are wonderful, but the heart is still just as big, right, in both of them. Shuffleton's wonderful, wonderful layers getting back to these musicians. Great piece. So Rockwell's ability to draw the human form, to draw hands that could tell just as much story as the faces, to draw faces where we understand what she's contemplating here. You know, very sensitive. He perfected that as he was painting, but he first learned it from his anatomy teacher, George Bridgman. And this is a painting by George Bridgman. George Bridgman was probably the most famous anatomy teacher of his day, taught at the Art Students League, and taught thousands of people, thousands of students going through his class. learning anatomy from the inside out, the mechanics of the human body, how joints worked against each other and with each other, the musculature, the construction of a human body. So George Bridgman was also educated in France. You're going to hear that over and over. George Bridgman studied with Gustave Boulanger and Jean-Léon Jerome. Boulanger taught at the Académie Julienne, which was a sort of a prep school in France, teaching people to draw the human figure so that they could enter the École des Beaux-Arts, the official state school. And Jean-Léon Jerome was the head teacher at the Académie, at the École des Beaux-Arts. He was one of three people that everyone finally had to study with. They had to choose their master. And Jerome was one of the most popular of all of them. And he was the one that accepted foreign students. So he had students from Russia and Spain and Italy and America. Yeah, great painting. Jean-Léon Jerome, like I said, a famous teacher for 40 years at the École, famous painter. His teacher was Marc Charles Glare, his second teacher. You'll see his first teacher in the next room. Marc Charles Glare, also very strong draftsman like Jerome. You can see his drawing ability in the feet, the hands, the heads, the construction. Here's that construction, that little box that they all build with the figures sitting in there in that space. You know.
Excuse me, can I ask a
Yeah,
question?
sure.
I beg your pardon.
No.
It's a curating question.
Yeah.
When you knew you wanted to do this, to get, the person who was the teacher and then the teacher up.
Right.
Did you approach the institutions by asking for a particular painting or by something that was representative?
I looked up. Yeah, I asked for that painter first, and if they had 4 or 5 paintings and said we could have our pick, I would do that. But that was not usually the case. Usually there was one painting.
Okay, I had one. So
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Like in this case, this is the only Marc Charles Glare that we could borrow from anyone in America. Most of his paintings are in France. Most of them are in Lausanne or France. And the reason that this is in America is that this painting was a commission by a wealthy American who said he wanted the finest Glare painting ever painted in America, so he was going to commission Glare to paint one. So that's the result. And I think he got a good deal. This painting is owned by the Chrysler Museum down in Norfolk. So again, here's that whole connection of George Bridgman to France, to Boulanger and Jerome, and then Jerome back even further to Glare, and Glare goes back even further. Okay. So I wanted to put these two pieces side by side so that you could see the preparation that Rockwell went through, the care that he put into a drawing, constructing this drawing, so that that there wasn't anything that he had to guess at when he got to the painting except for color. Okay, he's deciding what colors to put down and how his brush is going to actually put that paint on the canvas. Those are his decisions because he's worked out the entire composition. Now the reason that these are different sizes is that this drawing was prepared for a painting that's this size. It was painted for Henry Ford for the 50th anniversary of the Ford Motor Company. That's Henry Ford right there. So a nice touching painting. And the painting that's the same size as the drawing is hanging in Henry Ford's house. So then Rockwell was asked to paint a reduction of it, this one, for the museum. So he painted a smaller version to go in the museum. So when I asked for the painting, they said, you can have the museum one, but you can't. Which is nice because it's also a talking point that artists would create reductions of their paintings. You'll see a couple more as we go through. And you can see the changes that he made on this. There's a cat down here. There's no cat up here. There's a rug. No rug. He's got a wallpaper design here. In the big painting, it's painted in. No wallpaper there. So he's making certain choices, but the main composition, the dark, light, where all the elements are, is all worked out here. Okay. In the charcoal. Okay, let's move on to N.C. Wyeth. Oh, yeah.
Where are you going to start? Right here?
Can you photograph these?
Here?
Yeah.
Oh, we'll
Okay.
do it.
Okay, so for the second of the three artists that we decided to feature in the show, N.C. Wyeth, Newell Converse Wyeth, I prepared another tree. So this is N.C. Wyeth here, and his first major teacher, Eric Papp, who ran the Papp School in Boston, and his second teacher, Howard Pyle, who ran the Pyle School in Wilmington, Delaware. And as we run down, we'll run all the way down, and we get down to the same guy. We get down to Carl van Loo, 1705. And if we run down this side, we get to Joseph Murray Bien, same guy. Okay, so from about here down, all three of them share the same teachers, this group. The only difference here is that Howard Pyle's first teacher, Francis van der Velen, was from Antwerp, and there's an Antwerp line, but it eventually gets back to France, like everything does, right? These three early N.C. Wyeths are they're great. N.C. Wyeth was born in Needham, Massachusetts. Grew up there, was first educated in Boston, but he went out west right after, then he went to the Pyle School, and then he went out west to gather material for paintings. So he painted these paintings of of Native Americans and the mountain man coming down the trail, and they were printed in magazines. Offered as limited edition prints in the magazine. You could buy the whole set of the prints to hang on your wall. And they were also reproduced in the magazine. So N.C. Wyeth painted a great many very large, very exuberant kind of compositions. If we look at his work here, the magazine work, we can see the beginning of what he eventually concentrated on, which is his classic literature series. And he's telling stories here. This was an illustration for a poem in a magazine, called Back to the Farm. Great piece of painting. The color is wonderful. You can feel the heat in that painting. And even though he's outside, he's creating this space here with the figures, right? The well-drawn figures. He's very clearly able to draw an anatomically accurate figure in a space. You can feel that the space is right, the perspective feels right, the light and shadow. That's a result of his education. And his observational skills, of course. His initial education was through Eric Papp. This is an Eric Papp painting. Eric Papp was a painter and teacher who opened his own school in Boston. Papp was born in San Francisco. He was a child prodigy on the violin. And he played in the San Francisco Philharmonic when he was just a teenager. And, but he decided he wanted to be a painter. So he, like so many Americans at the time, he went to France. And he studied at the Académie Julienne with a great number of people, about 7 or 8 teachers. And at the time, the popular subject matter for a lot of the French painters in the late 1800s comes under the title of Orientalism. This is an example over here. The top of North Africa was known as the Orient at the time. And painters from France would travel through that area collecting reference and inspiration for paintings that they would paint, so-called exotic subject matter that they could sell to interested clients back home. So Papp was excited about that same sort of adventurous spirit, and he traveled on his own through Egypt. And this is one of his paintings that came from that experience. And one of the stories I like to tell is Papp actually climbed the Great Pyramid and tied himself to the top so that he could spend the night up there. He didn't want to roll off. So he spent the night on top of the pyramid so he could watch the sun rise over the Valley of Kings. Real character. So when he came back to the United States, he opened a school in Boston. And he and Anne Monroe, his wife, who was also she studied with Bouguereau, who we'll see in the next room. They both taught together, so they taught in Boston. And when she passed away about 10 years after that, after they started the school, he closed the school, kind of disappeared for a while. But he continued illustrating books. So Papp was N.C. Wyeth's first teacher. Taught him drawing so that Wyeth had the skills he needed. This is one of Papp's teachers here. This is Jean-Joseph Benjamin Constant. And Constant taught at the Académie Julienne, again, like Bollinger and some other folks in there. And Constant was known as a colorist. He, like so many of the French who were painting Orientalist pictures, traveled through North Africa and collected costumes and furniture and bric-a-brac and all the stuff that he needed when he brought to bring back to his studio, so he could hire models to wear the costumes so he could paint these pictures that he could sell. So a magazine, a client who wanted an exotic picture on his wall. So clients change, subject matter changes, but the principles don't. You still have to draw a hand that looks like a hand. You still have to draw a hand that looks like a hand, right? Again, N.C. Wyeth. When N.C. Wyeth first started illustrating, it was for magazines, and then this was his first classic book that he illustrated. This is from Treasure Island. Treasure Island in 1911. He started painting classic literature, and the pieces for Treasure Island are just wonderful. Great piece. Really, his compositions are really dynamic. You know, if you compare his compositions to Rockwell's are quieter. They're more intimate. Wyeth's are full of action, right? I think that's they're personalities, right? And this is another painting by Papp, and here you can see he's painting someone playing a violin. So I think he still had violin back in the back of his brain there. This is for a book of poems by Madison Cawein. It's a great book of poems. It was called the Keats of Kentucky. Another one of Eric Papp's teachers. This is Jean-Paul Laurens, who taught again at the Académie Julienne. And Jean-Paul Laurens was a painter of rather obscure historical subject matter. And this painting is this is Honorius. Honorius was one of the sons of the emperor who divided the Holy Roman Empire in two halves. Gave half of it to Honorius and the other half to his brother. And Honorius ended up losing the whole deal. That was the end of the Holy Roman Empire. So this is the beginning of the end. And so showing Honorius too small for the throne, too small to hold his father's powerful sword and the globe of power. His feet don't even touch the ground, right? Just dangling away. Yeah. Great piece. So Jean-Paul Laurens, also a French teacher. N.C. Wyeth, again, this is from Kidnapped, his second book by Robert Louis Stevenson. He illustrated three books by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this is from N.C. Wyeth's book of King Arthur, The Tales of King Arthur. And this is, that's King Arthur right there in Merlin's arms, being taken from the castle where he was raised by the wise man. So N.C. Wyeth, after N.C. Wyeth honed his drawing skills under Papp, he transferred to Howard Pyle's school. And Howard Pyle was probably the most famous illustration teacher ever. He started the first school of illustration in America. And first he taught at the Drexel Institute for about 6 years. He taught an illustration class, and then he started his own school. He built studios right behind his own house, and in Wilmington, Delaware. And all the students who came already had to have some drawing skills down. He didn't want to teach basic drawing. He could have, certainly, but he didn't want to spend time doing that. He wanted to inspire these students to really create paintings that had real depth to them, a real spirit. And you can see that in Pyle's painting. His emotion is right on the canvas. Great painter, great teacher. He painted murals, and he was an author. Wrote the Robin Hood story that we all know is his. All the King Arthur legends. He wrote a multi-volume set of those. Otto of the Silver Hand, Men of Iron, some great pieces. This is a series. These four paintings were printed in a magazine, and they accompanied a story that he wrote. One of his stories. He wrote a great many stories for magazines, and over the years he created about 3,000 illustrations, an enormous number of paintings. This set he painted to accompany the story called Travels of the Soul. The soul enters a human body, leaves paradise, finds love, experiences grief, and in the end returns to the heavenly home. But this was also an experiment in color. Color printing, this is printed in 1902, and color printing was still in its infancy. The four-color press, black, red, yellow, blue, he wanted to see if that press could pick up that kind of detail, these two doves in the bottom, and the bright blue at the same time. Wanted to see if he could pick up a really vibrant red and a vibrant green at the same time. Tricky stuff to do, but they did it. They did a good job. And I was on press when we printed the catalog, and we had to go through the same tricky business. And we did it too. So another Howard Pyle here. He's just a great painting, beautiful piece. This was for a story. He didn't write the story. It's for another story in a magazine. So Howard Pyle, his first teacher was Francis van der Velen, as I was talking about over there, who came from Antwerp. There are no Francis van der Velen paintings around, which is why there's nothing right here. There's no portrait of Francis van der Velen. I should tell you that all the portraits that I drew on there are from, I didn't make up any of those faces. They're all from paintings of those artists, except for Francis van der Velen. There's no portrait. He was a young teacher, came to America in his early 20s, and he opened a school when the Pennsylvania Academy was closed for 4 years for renovations. And he taught a number of people, Howard Pyle being one of them. He returned to Antwerp right after Pennsylvania Academy opened up again. He closed his school. He got married, moved back to Antwerp, and died within the year. And we don't know why. But I found his school records, and so I knew who his teachers were. And his teacher was von Larius, who goes back through a number of teachers in Antwerp to a time when the French had occupied the country, and that teacher was educated in France. So things happen. So Howard Pyle's second teacher, after Howard Pyle studied with Francis van der Velen, he moved to New York City to start his illustration career. And he started illustrating for magazines like these. And he decided to take painting classes at the National Academy of Design. At the Art Students League, excuse me. And this teacher here, Lemuel Wilmarth, was teaching at the Art Students League at that time. The reason I get that mixed up is that Lemuel Wilmarth was the very first teacher, full-time teacher at the National Academy of Design. And when they had to close and started the Art Students League, he became the first teacher at the Art Students League. And a couple of years later, he decided to go back to the National Academy of Design because they reopened and he wanted to help them out. He's a really important character as far as education is concerned. The first full-time teacher at both of those schools. And he not only brought the French way of teaching into the classroom, he started the quick sketch idea, which was a nice innovation for illustrators who had to learn how to sketch rapidly when they were reporting for newspapers. They would go out and see some scene, and they would sketch what was happening, and that was printed in the paper in lieu of photography. So Lemuel Wilmarth was also, besides those other noteworthy facts, Lemuel Wilmarth was also Jean-Leon Jerome's first American student. So this is Jean-Leon Jerome again, who I showed you in the last room, the most important teacher at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This is Jerome's painting of Moliere, Lynching with the King. Great little piece. And this is Paul Della. I show you the Mark Charles glare. That was Jerome's second teacher. This was Jerome's first teacher, Paul Della. And Paul Della here is painting history for an English collector. And this history is not as romantically heroic as the painting of Napoleon by David, where Napoleon is crossing the Alps on his great charger with his cape blowing behind him, looking all of 6'5". And this is the real Napoleon sitting on a mule being carried through the Alps by his mountain guide. So Della was about reporting history the way that pretty much he could reconstruct it. He was well known for his history paintings. He passed that same love of history on to his student Jerome, who passed his ability to paint figures on to his student Wilmarth, who passed his abilities to handle the paint to Howard Pyle. Della was a student of Antoine Gros, and this painting is called Anonymous, this painter, because we're not sure exactly who this is. At different times, it was considered a painting by Gros, who was Della Roach's teacher, or a painting by David, who was Gros' teacher, but it might not be either one. We don't know. But it represents the classical mode of painting at the time, where you can see the very idealized figure. The proportions have been manipulated, but the same basic idea of being able to paint the correct anatomy, light and shadow, happens all the way through. So French to America. Okay, Maxfield Parrish. How are we doing?
Good.
Yeah?
Good.
Okay. Let's see.
Dennis, if you could just mention if everybody could stay on the carpet, please. And
Okay.
for our artwork, I'd appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Okay, this is a smaller room, and we need to make sure that we're not stepping off the carpet to bump into a painting. Okay, so try to stay on the carpet. Thank you. So the third of our three artists, Maxfield Parrish. Again, I drew a tree of Maxfield Parrish. His teacher Robert Vonau, his teacher Thomas Anschutz. And they wander down there. There's Jean-Leon Jerome, who we've seen twice now. There's Gros, who we'll see in a minute. There's Gros, there's Della Roach. So they travel on down, and here we are at Carl van Loo, once again, and Joseph Marie Vienne, once again. Same two guys at the bottom. So Maxfield Parrish, the similarities between Rockwell and Wyeth and Parrish are great. Their ability to draw, their storytelling, and their basic education. It's all pretty similar. But then they diverge as individual artists. Rockwell's pieces are definitely not like Wyeth's. They're recognizable. Parrish is definitely recognizable from Wyeth and Rockwell. Recognizable because he's inventing this world, this kind of dreamlike world. Not just the subject matter, but the paint itself, the way that he's applying paint, his color choices, what he's putting next to what. This painting, The Storm, and even more importantly, this one. Let me go over here. This one, The Lantern Bearers. Especially in this one, because this is in such pristine condition for showing his use of glazing. Maxfield Parrish would set up his models as all these painters would in costumes that he built. The gathering of reference was a major part of creating all of these paintings. All these painters had to have storage for their costumes and their props and all that. Parrish had a large studio full of costumes that he designed and had made. This is his model, Sue Lewin, who actually made most of those costumes. And so then he would pose his models, photograph them, so that he had reference to draw from, and then he would compose his pictures. Once his pictures were composed, he started layering his colors transparently. So all the colors that you see here, you're seeing through. You're not looking at. In the Rockwell, you're looking at the paint. In Wyeth, you're looking at the paint. In Parrish, you're looking through the paint to the white of the board, and the light is bouncing back out through all those layers, somewhat like holding a slide or looking at stained glass. And that blue is probably 6 layers of blue put on. He would put a transparent layer of blue down, thinned out with linseed oil, then he would put a coat of varnish And that, when that was dry, he'd put another thin coat of blue, and then another coat of varnish. Varnish is transparent. And then another, and another, and another. And the more layers that there were, the deeper the color got, the more vibrant it actually got. And he did the same with the yellows and the same with the reds. And when he was done with the three, he was done. Okay, he's probably got 3 or 4 different kinds of yellow in there and a half a dozen kinds of red. And layer, layer, layer. There's a little bit of blue in that, of course. So Parrish painted a lot of these pictures for magazines. This was painted as a cover for Collier's magazine. And he illustrated books and magazines, and he was also a muralist. A lot of great murals. There's a beautiful mural in New York City, another in San Francisco. And his series for the Curtis building are all in Rhode Island. So Parrish studied first at Haverford College as an architect. And but after 3 years, he decided he wanted to paint. So he transferred and he studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. So Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts was the oldest school in the country, oldest museum, school combination anywhere, and it's still going. Has a great collection, and it's had great teachers over the years. So when Parrish went there to study, his teacher was Thomas Anschutz, one of his teachers. And Thomas Anschutz taught at the Pennsylvania Academy for 40 years, I think. I think I have that down there. 30 or 40 years. And Thomas Anschutz, this is a painting of the family maid, Aunt Hannah. He painted 4 paintings of her. Thomas Anschutz was the first a student monitor for Thomas Eakins. And then when Eakins was asked to leave, Thomas Anschutz became the teacher, the painting teacher. And but Thomas Anschutz's teacher was Thomas Eakins, and this is Thomas Eakins here. Thomas Eakins, the probably one of America's best-known realist painters, and Thomas Eakins had studied with Jean Leon Jerome. There's Jerome again for the 3rd time. He was actually his second American student, Jerome's second American student after Wilmarth. When Eakins came back, he brought the French method of teaching to the Pennsylvania Academy, revamped the whole curriculum, and so schools, Pennsylvania Academy, National Academy of Design, the Art Students League, and the Papp School were all teaching that French model. But the first one was Eakins' changed curriculum at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where he also brought in dissection. They would dissect human cadavers and horse cadavers so that they can understand the articulation of joints and what muscles acted on what bones. So Eakins studied in France with Jean-Leon Jerome. Here's Jean-Leon Jerome's painting of Michelangelo being led by a young boy to feel the Belvedere torso statue. Now this is a complete invention of Jerome's, and we know that for sure because the Belvedere torso is about half that size, and Michelangelo was never blind, and he never owned the Belvedere torso. So, but he's telling a great story here. So Jerome's first teacher, who painted Napoleon, was Paul Della Roach. And again, here's another Della Roach. And I wanted to put this one in here because this is Paul Della Roach's painting. This is a reduction. Just like the Rockwell was a reduction. The original painting is about the size of this ball. And he painted it when he was a student. He was just in his early 20s, 21 years old. And he painted that for a family chapel in France. And then he painted this reduction himself, like Rockwell painted that reduction himself, for sale, so that a client could have that painting. He painted 4 of those Napoleons. that we saw in the other room. It was a way for them to make money and a way for a collector to actually own an original piece of work that they wanted, and there was only one, so they wanted another one. And every time there was a reduction, they made a little change in it. Rockwell's doing the same thing. Okay, so Maxfield Parrish again over here. This is a great piece. Gradually, the figures in Parrish's paintings became less important to him, and the landscape started to take over. In the last 30 years of his life, he lived into his 90s. But when he was in his mid-60s, he decided that he was done painting figures. He was going to paint just landscapes. So at a time when most everyone retires, he launched another career. He painted landscapes for 30 years, beautiful things. This is before that. This is earlier. But again, you can see his glazing technique here and what that does. Okay, so I put this Parrish next to another Anschutz who painted Aunt Hannah over there. And this was one of the last paintings Anschutz painted before he went to France. He was teaching at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, taught there for about 10, 12 years, and decided he wanted to go to France, like his teacher Akins had done, and get an education there. So he went to he left America, went to France, studied at the Académie Julienne with William Bouguereau. And these two paintings here are by William Bouguereau, who was in his lifetime considered one of the finest figure painters alive. And deservedly so. If you look at these feet and hands, they're just so nicely drawn, so beautiful. This great work. So those are two pieces by Bouguereau, and Bouguereau, like I said, taught at the Académie Julienne, and he taught with this guy over here, Lefebvre. This painting here, I wanted to show you this one painting by Anschutz. When Anschutz left to go study with Bouguereau, you can see what Bouguereau is doing here. He's filling his canvas with the figures, right? They're very large. And when Anschutz came back from France, this is what he painted like almost the rest of his life, were very large figures filling up the canvas. So even though his touch is a lot looser, because he was also looking at Impressionists at this time. And so you can see some of that impressionistic brushwork here, but the underlying drawing is a lot like Bouguereau's little knitter, the girl over there. So Parrish at the Pennsylvania Academy, there's another great example of Parrish's glazing technique, that blue and that gold that just shine off of here. This is his piece for Cinderella. He painted about a dozen pieces based on fairy tales that ended up on covers of magazines. It was going to be a book, but it never made it. Just like the Ichabod Crane from Rockwell was going to be a book, but it never made it. But the painting survived. So, this is Parrish's Cinderella piece, and this is a great little corner in here as far as seeing how people put paint on the canvas. He's putting it on transparently. You can hardly see any brush strokes. You can't see any thick paint on here. It's very, very thin. His teacher, Robert Vonau, who was Anschutz's partner, Robert Vonau is painting very impressionistically. His drawing is still just as solid here and here, right? That hand, look at that hand that's drawn very nicely there. But the paint is put on in broken brush strokes, like an impressionist. Vonau was very taken with the impressionists. He lived in France for many years after he taught at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And his teacher in France was Jules Joseph Lefebvre. And Lefebvre, you can see his method of putting the paint down, it's all opaque. It's just as thick, but he's blending it very, very carefully and softly, like Boudreaux. This painting of the woman in the kimono shows another attraction for the exotic that the French collectors wanted in their paintings. And this is the fascination with Japan. Okay, there. I'll tell him about the last room. Okay, the last room, which is a very narrow room, so you'll have to feed into it a little bit. On one wall, if you go in and look at this wall, I have drawings by. There's a drawing by Rockwell, a drawing by his teacher Bridgman, a drawing by his teacher Jerome, a drawing by his teacher's teacher's teacher Lepasy, and you can see that the drawings look pretty much the same. To draw from a figure, to observe a human figure and to draw their hand, you have to just really look at it and draw it. It doesn't have anything to do with the period of time that they're in, like this. You can see, you can almost date these pictures by the way that they're applying paint, but it's hard to date the drawings. They all look pretty much alike. Then on the far wall, there are paintings by that I've put from the very earliest painter that we have in the show, which is Lorenzo de' Bicci from 1400. There's a painting in there. And you'll see two more trees. You'll see the trees of those two fellows at the bottom, Van Loo and Vienne. And they go down and they go through Botticelli and Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci. And then on the back wall is Rich's wonderful digital wall, where you can see all the paintings that we didn't get for the show, because this is plenty. And there are 70 some artists going all the way back to 1400, and you can follow them all the way back. And if you tap on their face, the information comes up, and you can read their bio. And then if you tap on each one of the paintings, they come up so you can see their paintings. Okay. So that's it. Thanks.
That's an interesting study. Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us.